So if you remember at the beginning of 2014, we did a sermon series where we asked everybody to do an exercise where we worked on the idea of one word that would guide us through the entire year. Do you remember that back in 2014? So my one word was enough. That was my one word, which I suppose, depending on how you say it, can mean any number of things. Enough, right? But I think that what I took away was the idea that God was using enough to speak to me about, don't worry. That whatever it is that you think is limited, that's scarce, that's not being provided, it will be provided. And whether that is enough time, enough energy, enough money to do what needs doing. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that there will be enough to do everything, but it means that there will be enough to do what needs to be done right at this moment, according to God's design. And there are plenty of examples I could draw from at the moment. You heard me say earlier, Stephanie and I are in the middle of this process of buying a house. And Stephanie and I have two different styles in terms of how we approach some kind of a financial commitment like this. I go to my computer and immediately pull up a spreadsheet and begin to work and enter numbers. And I'm furiously working on that. Well, meanwhile, Stephanie tends to be a little more intuitive. She understands what comes in and goes out of the bank account every month. And her response is, don't worry, we'll adjust. And I remember all the times that we have adjusted. And you probably remember times in your life when you've had to adjust as well. One of the things that a lot of families go through and that we went through, when we had our second daughter, it just didn't make any sense to pay for daycare for two kids, right? And so it felt like at the time, when Stephanie stepped away from the job that she'd been doing, our income went down 60%, right? And at the time, it was like, wow, how will we be able to do that? And I can't tell you exactly how that worked out, but I know that it did. And I imagine some of you have had similar experiences as well. So Jesus, as he's preaching this message, he is preaching on this hillside in Galilee. And if you can imagine, the hills of Galilee are just unbelievably beautiful. And so if you can imagine standing on this hillside, beautifully green, with flowers leading down to the water. And among the people that Jesus is speaking to are his disciples. These are people that he's called from their familiar everyday, from their stable, maybe not great paying jobs, but decent paying jobs, things that allowed them to take care of their families. He's called them and said, follow me. And they're doing this new thing. They're living this new path of faith that Jesus has called them to walk. And Jesus had sent them out saying, I want you to go out and I want you to preach. I want you to share the good news with the people that you meet, but I don't want you to take any money with you. I want you to be reliant on the hospitality of the people whom you meet, because a worker who goes out is worth his wages. And that was frightening, I'm sure. That was threatening to them. And there's good reason for that. We've been talking throughout how our doubts have a purpose in our lives. And, the question of enough is a doubt that has a purpose as well, just like all the other doubts we've talked about. And God gave us these doubts that crop up to keep us from doing dumb things, to keep us from spending too much, to keep us from getting into debt over our heads. There are a lot of people for whom a little bit of doubt and a little bit of fear would do a tremendous amount of good. So again, doubt has this purpose of self-preservation and self-protection, which is mostly good. Mostly good. The thing about following a guy, though, who went to a cross, is that sometimes, much of the time, nearly all the time, he's pushing us to think about things that are much bigger than our own self-preservation, our own self-protection. He may ask us to do certain things that we never expected to do. He may ask us to give up certain things that we really value. He may ask us to go places, to take on tasks where we feel completely uncomfortable and completely unprepared in order to fulfill his mission, in order to carry out that which he has for us in the world, to bring love and to bring peace and to bring hope to people who otherwise would not know those things. That's what Jesus calls us to do. And that's where the disciples are. Hey, Jesus, you've called us to leave everything. And now, how is it that we know that everything's going to be okay? How do we know that this is going to work out? And so he turns their attention to something that they know. He says, take a look at the birds. Take a look at the lilies of the field and learn from them. Don't you think that God cares for them? And don't you think that God cares for you? We're always concerned about enough. Whether there will be enough for whatever it is that we feel like we need to do or want to do. We can't run from that. We can't shut it off. That doubt is always within us. And like I said, there's a reason for it. It has a purpose. But just like everything else in the spiritual life, doubt, this kind of doubt, has a double-edged, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because too much fear holds us back. Keeps us from pursuing that which God has called us to pursue. A ministry, a calling, a new way of living. And we can think of not being able to afford it in a whole host of ways. We can think of it in terms of money. We can think of it in terms of time. We can think of it in terms of energy. We can think of it in terms of commitment. It takes a lot for us to decide to make a change. And yet, Jesus thinks that because he went to the cross, he has the right to ask us to do crazy things to do too. Right? Just because he went to the cross. He feels like he can ask us to do anything. Silly Jesus, right? We heard this morning about the idea of pursuing this project that we've been talking about for 10 years. And I know that it's a huge undertaking. And people have wondered to me, not once, not twice, but many times out loud, will we actually do this? Right? My answer is yes, we will. That which God has put on our hearts and sent us forth to achieve, it will be accomplished. I'm convinced that this is the moment that God has called us to. Because there are ministry opportunities all around us. And even just in the past week, I've had the opportunity to talk with people and come to a deeper understanding of what's happening in the community, the transitions that are happening in the community. One of the people that's going to be joining our church this morning, she said, and her husband backed her up on this, that she visited no less than 100 churches before she settled on this. Right? That's something. That's really something, in my mind. It says something about what's going on here in this place that's unique, that's different. Building a building isn't the ministry that actually transforms lives, but it creates a space where we have the opportunity to be able to walk alongside people as that happens. You know, as a church, 2,000 years after the disciples, we want to think that, well, you know, we don't need to have the same level of faith that the disciples had. That somehow we don't, you know, we're not called to do as crazy and radical things as what the disciples were called to do. But the thing is, Jesus hasn't forgotten about the cross. He kind of keeps bringing it up. We say, you know what, it's too hard. And Jesus says, well, let me tell you about a time. And we say, wait, you're going to talk about the cross again? Yeah. We're challenged to do things that we don't want to do, things that we feel like are beyond our capacity. We're challenged to do things where we say, you know, will there be enough? Will I have enough within me? Will there be enough resources? Will there be enough time? Will there be enough energy? Will there be enough people? Will there be enough? How much faith does it take for us to trust that everything is going to turn out okay? We worry about all of those things. And we're challenged by our fear of whether or not there's going to be enough. But I wonder, who is it that gets to decide what enough looks like? I think that's part of the question here in this passage that we read. Who is it that gets to decide what is enough? If it's up to us, I don't suppose that anything would ever look like enough if it's left up to us. When Jesus talks about serving two masters, he's talking about God and money. But he could just as easily have said God or yourself. On some level, it's the same thing. I'm not naive enough to believe that Christians don't lose their jobs, or that Christian businesses don't fail, or that Christians, both in this country and around the world, don't suffer economic struggles and economic hardships. And that's what's hard. This passage doesn't really speak to any of that. It simply says trust. We want something. We want a passage of Scripture that's going to solve all of our problems. But we know that birds starve sometimes. That's a reality, right? We understand that. And again, this passage doesn't speak to that. We want something that's going to take away all of our doubts, but I don't know that this can. Instead, what I think it's meant to do is reset our priorities. And maybe that's the first step towards overcoming this particular doubt of whether or not there will be enough. Jesus says that he only wants to know one thing, more or less. He wants to know who's in charge. Who's in charge of our lives? Who's in charge of the church? No one can serve two masters. That's what Jesus says. So we choose, and then we follow. So for moms, for dads, for grandmothers, for grandfathers, children and parents and husbands and wives, Jesus calls us to reconsider this morning what it is that we would call enough. And Jesus calls us to think about that through the eyes of someone who gave everything, unselfishly, for the sake of God's love. Amen?